The snow fell like ash upon the funeral pyres. 3 columns of smoke rose into the gray winter sky above the fortress of Ravencrest, carrying the souls of fallen warriors to whatever peace awaited them beyond the veil. King Aldrich Ravencrest stood at the edge of the ceremonial platform, his massive frame rigid against the biting wind, watching the flames consume the bodies of men who had served him faithfully for over 2 decades. The crowd gathered below numbered in the hundreds, warriors in ceremonial armor, council members in their dark robes, common folk who had traveled from distant villages to witness the grim spectacle, all of them silent, all of them afraid. The attack on the northern border had not been a random raid by desperate rogues. It had been a message written in blood and steel. The bodies had been returned to Ravencrest 3 days ago, dumped at the main gate like discarded refuse. Each warrior had been stripped of weapons and armor. Each throat had been cut with surgical precision. And pinned to the chest of the patrol captain was a note written in crimson ink that still haunted the king's dreams. "Your time has ended. The age of Ravencrest falls." Aldrich's hands trembled beneath the folds of his ceremonial cloak. Not from cold, not from grief, from the creeping certainty that everything he had built over 6 decades of life was crumbling beneath his feet. His kingdom, his legacy, his bloodline. He glanced to his left where his son stood apart from the other mourners. Prince Caspian Ravencrest, heir to the throne, the silent prince, as the common folk called him behind closed doors, the broken one, as his enemies whispered with barely concealed contempt. Caspian was 28 years old, tall and lean where his father was broad and powerful. His dark hair fell across his forehead, partially obscuring the pale scar that ran from his right temple down the side of his neck and disappeared beneath the collar of his black mourning coat. The wound that had stolen his voice 5 years ago. The wound that had transformed him from a promising young alpha into something the pack struggled to understand. A prince who could not speak. A future king who could not rally his troops with rousing speeches or negotiate treaties through the power of his words. In a society built upon strength and dominance, upon the thundering authority of an alpha's command, Caspian's silence was viewed as the ultimate weakness. Aldrich watched his son's face as the flames consumed their fallen warriors. Caspian's expression remained perfectly still. His amber eyes reflected the dancing firelight, but revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. To the casual observer, he appeared cold, detached, perhaps even indifferent to the tragedy unfolding before him. But Aldrich knew better. He had learned to read the subtle language of his son's silence over these long and lonely years. The slight tension in his jaw, the almost imperceptible tightening of his fists, the way his gaze tracked across the crowd, cataloging faces, noting positions, filing away information that others dismissed as irrelevant. Caspian was not indifferent. He was furious. And beneath that fury, Aldrich sensed something even more dangerous: calculation. The ceremony continued with the traditional recitation of the warriors' deeds. Elder Brennan, the senior member of the King's Council, stepped forward to deliver the eulogy. He was an ancient creature, over 90 years old, with a white beard that reached the middle of his chest and eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of 3 generations of Ravencrest rulers. His voice carried across the silent crowd with surprising strength. "We gather today to honor Marcus Stone," Brennan intoned. "Captain of the Northern Watch for 23 years, father of 2 sons, grandfather of 4. He gave his life defending our borders against the darkness that threatens us all." Aldrich listened to the familiar words, but his attention remained fixed on his son. Caspian had not moved from his isolated position at the edge of the platform. He had not acknowledged the mourning families who glanced his way with expressions ranging from pity to suspicion. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. For what? The question had haunted Aldrich for 5 years, since that terrible night when assassins had breached the palace defenses. Since his beloved wife had died in his arms, her blood warm against his hands. Since Caspian had thrown himself between the queen and a silver blade, taking the wound meant for her heart across his own throat. The boy had saved nothing. The queen had died anyway, her injuries too severe for even the most skilled healers. And Caspian had paid for his courage with his voice, his vocal cords severed beyond repair. In the aftermath, Aldrich had retreated into grief. He had buried his wife in the family crypt beneath the fortress. He had ordered the execution of the captured assassins without bothering to discover who had hired them. He had thrown himself into the duties of kingship with a desperate intensity that left no room for mourning. And in doing so, he had abandoned his son. The realization came to Aldrich with the slow and terrible clarity of dawn breaking over a battlefield littered with the dead. He had looked at Caspian and seen only his wife's dying face. He had heard his son's silence and felt only the echoing absence of her voice. He had allowed his grief to transform into distance, and that distance had calcified into something that felt uncomfortably like betrayal. Now, watching Caspian stand alone against the winter sky, Aldrich understood that the boy had been fighting his own war for 5 years, a war against whispered doubts and open mockery, a war against a council that questioned his fitness to rule, a war against enemies both foreign and domestic who saw his silence as an invitation to strike. And Aldrich had not been there to help him fight it. The funeral ended with the traditional howl of mourning. Hundreds of voices rose into the winter air, a primal cry of grief and defiance that echoed off the stone walls of Ravencrest and rolled across the snow-covered landscape. Aldrich added his own voice to the chorus, feeling the sound vibrate through his chest and throat with a power that bordered on painful. Caspian remained silent. Of course he did. He had no voice to add to the mourning cry. But Aldrich noticed that his son's lips moved silently, forming words that no one else could hear. A private farewell to fallen warriors. A promise, perhaps, or a threat. The crowd began to disperse as the pyres burned down to glowing embers. Council members retreated to the warmth of the great hall. Warriors returned to their posts. Mourning families accepted condolences from neighbors and friends before beginning the long journey home. Aldrich moved to approach his son, but a firm hand on his arm stopped him. "Your Majesty." General Marcus Thorne stood at his side, a weathered veteran of 62 years whose gray hair and scarred face told the story of a lifetime spent in service to the Ravencrest throne. He had been Aldrich's closest friend since childhood, and one of the few men alive who could speak freely in the king's presence. "What is it?" "The council is assembling." Marcus kept his voice low, his eyes scanning the dispersing crowd with professional vigilance. "They want to discuss the attack and the succession." Aldrich felt his jaw tighten. "The succession is not in question. Forgive me, old friend, but it is." Marcus's expression held no judgment, only concern. The council members have been talking. Some of them believe that Caspian is unfit to lead, that his silence makes him vulnerable to manipulation and control. They want to discuss alternatives. "There are no alternatives. Caspian is my son and my heir." "I know, but you need to hear what they have to say. Ignoring their concerns will only make them more dangerous." Aldrich looked across the platform to where Caspian still stood, his figure stark against the gray sky. The young prince had not moved during the entire exchange. He appeared lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the smoldering remains of the funeral pyres. "Very well." Aldrich squared his shoulders. "Assemble the council. I will hear their concerns." "And your son?" Aldrich hesitated. His instinct was to protect Caspian from the council's doubts and criticisms, to shield him from the pain of hearing his own advisors question his right to rule. But perhaps that had been the problem all along. Perhaps his protection had been indistinguishable from abandonment. "My son will attend as well. It is time he heard the truth about what we face." The council chamber was located in the oldest section of the Ravencrest fortress, a circular room with high windows that let in the weak winter light. The stone walls were lined with tapestries depicting the history of the Ravencrest bloodline, stretching back over 300 years. Kings and queens, great battles and famous victories, a legacy of strength and dominance that now seemed increasingly fragile. Aldrich took his place at the head of the massive oak table, his throne chair carved with the symbols of his house. To his right sat the empty chair that had once belonged to his queen. He had ordered it removed after her death, but somehow it had returned to its place, a silent reminder of everything he had lost. To his left sat Caspian. The prince had entered the council chamber without fanfare, taking his seat with the quiet dignity that characterized all his public appearances. If he was surprised by his inclusion in this emergency meeting, he gave no sign. His face remained the same mask of careful neutrality that had become his shield against a world that could not understand him. The council members filtered in over the next few minutes. Elder Brennan claimed his traditional seat at the king's right hand, his ancient eyes sharp despite his advanced years. Lord Harwick and Lady Frost represented the noble houses, their expressions carefully neutral, but their body language radiating tension. Commander Victor Blackwood, captain of the Royal Guard, took his position near the door, his dark eyes sweeping the room with predatory alertness. And at the far end of the table, General Marcus settled into his chair with the ease of a man who had attended thousands of such meetings and survived them all. Aldrich let the silence stretch for several heartbeats, studying the faces of his advisors. Some met his gaze with apparent loyalty. Others avoided his eyes with telling discomfort. All of them were afraid, he realized. Afraid of the unknown enemy at their borders. Afraid of the uncertain future that awaited them. Afraid of him. "You know why we are here." Aldrich's voice carried the weight of decades of command. 3 of our finest warriors are dead. Our northern border has been breached, and we have received a threat that cannot be ignored. Lord Harwick leaned forward, his thin face pinched with concern. "The message mentioned the end of our time. Does your Majesty have any indication of who sent it?" "Not yet." Aldrich glanced at Victor. "Commander, what have your investigations revealed?" Victor straightened, his hand resting on the hilt of the ceremonial sword at his hip. The attackers were professionals. Their approach and retreat showed military training far beyond what we typically see from rogue bands. They knew our patrol routes. They knew our defensive weaknesses. They struck with precision and withdrew before our reinforcements could arrive. "You are saying we have a traitor in our midst." The words came not from Aldrich, but from Elder Brennan. The old man's voice was soft, almost gentle, but his eyes were cold. "I am saying it is possible." Victor's jaw tightened. Someone provided the attackers with information. Whether that someone is a member of this council or a lower-ranking officer, I cannot yet say. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Council members exchanged uneasy glances. Lady Frost shifted in her chair. Lord Harwick dabbed at his forehead with a silk handkerchief. Aldrich raised a hand, forestalling the eruption of accusations and denials he could see building. "We will investigate the possibility of betrayal, but that is not why I called this council." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The threat we face is larger than a single attack or even a single traitor. Our enemies sense weakness in Ravencrest. They believe we are vulnerable. Because of the prince." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. All eyes turned to Victor, who had spoken with calm deliberation. Aldrich felt his hands clench beneath the table. "Explain yourself, Commander." Victor met the king's gaze without flinching. "Your Majesty asked for honesty. I am providing it. The other kingdoms know that Prince Caspian cannot speak. They interpret his silence as weakness, as proof that the Ravencrest bloodline has grown fragile. This attack may be a test to see how we respond, to measure our resolve before a larger assault." Caspian's expression did not change. He sat perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on Victor with an intensity that would have unnerved a lesser man. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken challenge. Elder Brennan cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should consider alternatives to the current succession." His voice was carefully reasonable, the tone of a man offering helpful advice rather than plotting treason. Prince Caspian's condition makes traditional leadership difficult. If he cannot address his subjects, cannot negotiate with foreign powers, cannot command troops in battle, then perhaps it would be wise to explore other options, such as a regency perhaps, a council of advisors who would rule in the prince's name while he maintains a ceremonial role, or alternatively, the voice dropped to barely above a whisper, the designation of a different heir from among the noble houses. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Aldrich felt something dark and dangerous stir in his chest. The wolf within him, the primal beast that lay at the core of every shapeshifter's soul, recognized the threat in Brennan's words and responded with instinctive fury. "You speak of disinheriting my son. I speak of protecting the kingdom." Brennan spread his hands in a gesture of false humility. The succession has always been about what is best for all of Ravencrest, not just the royal family. If Prince Caspian cannot lead effectively, then we must consider alternatives. Surely His Majesty sees the wisdom in this. Aldrich opened his mouth to respond, but a sharp gesture from his left stopped him. Caspian had risen to his feet. The prince moved with deliberate grace to the writing desk that stood against the wall, a piece of furniture that had been placed there years ago as an accommodation for his condition. He picked up the chalk that rested in its holder and approached the large slate board that hung beside the tapestries. Every eye in the room followed his movements. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Even Victor's hand tightened on his sword hilt, though whether from anticipation or concern was impossible to say. Caspian began to write. His strokes were firm and clear, the letters appearing on the dark slate with crisp precision. The enemy wants us to doubt ourselves. The enemy wants us to fight among ourselves. By questioning my fitness to rule, you are doing the enemy's work for them. A murmur rippled through the council. Brennan's eyes narrowed, but he made no response. Caspian erased the board and continued writing. I have watched. I have listened. I have prepared. My silence is not weakness. It is patience. When the time comes, you will see what I have been building. He turned to face the council, his amber eyes burning with a fire that none of them had ever seen. For a moment, despite his lack of voice, he dominated the room with his presence alone. The wolf within him, the alpha bloodline that ran back 300 years, radiated power and authority that transcended mere words. Then the door burst open. A warrior stumbled into the council chamber, his uniform stained with mud and blood. His face was pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Your Majesty. The messenger steadied himself against the doorframe. News from the southern villages. There has been another attack. Far from the politics and power struggles of Ravencrest, in a small village nestled against the kingdom's southern border, Seraphina knelt beside the bed of a dying man and tried to remember everything her grandmother had taught her about healing. The warrior's wounds were severe, 3 deep gashes across his chest, inflicted by claws rather than blades, a shattered collarbone, internal bleeding that had already begun to pool beneath his skin, turning it the mottled purple of approaching death. She had been treating the injured for 3 days now, ever since the survivors of the border patrol had staggered into the village seeking shelter and aid. 7 men had arrived. 2 had died within hours of their arrival. 3 others clung to life by the thinnest of threads. This one, the youngest of the group, had perhaps the best chance of survival. If she could stop the bleeding, if she could set the bone properly, if his body could fight off the infection that was already beginning to take hold. Stay with me. Seraphina's voice was soft but firm as she worked. I need you to stay conscious. Can you tell me your name? The warrior's eyes fluttered open. They were blue, she noticed. A pale winter blue that reminded her of frozen lakes. Garrett. His voice was barely audible. My name is Garrett. Good. That is good, Garrett. I need you to keep talking to me while I work. Can you do that? I will try. She cleaned the wounds with water boiled with healing herbs, a technique her grandmother had perfected over decades of practice. The old woman had been the village healer for as long as anyone could remember, a mysterious figure who seemed to know things that no one else did. She had died 2 years ago, leaving Seraphina as the only one who knew her secrets. Well, most of her secrets. Seraphina had always been different. Even as a child, she had possessed an unusual awareness of the bodies around her. She could sense injury and illness in ways she could not explain. She could predict the movements of others before they made them, reading the subtle tensions in their muscles, the shifts in their balance, the tells that betrayed their intentions. Her grandmother had called it the gift of the crescent moon. She had spoken of it rarely and always in whispers, as if afraid that someone might overhear. It was a legacy, she said, an inheritance from a time before the Great War, when their kind had been different. Neither fully wolf nor fully human, but something in between. Seraphina had never fully understood what her grandmother meant, but she had learned to use her gift. She had learned to hide it as well, concealing her abilities behind the acceptable role of village healer. In a society that valued conformity and strength, being different was dangerous. Being an Omega was dangerous enough. She was 25 years old, with hair so pale it appeared almost silver in certain light. Her features were delicate, her frame slender. By all outward appearances, she was exactly what her designation suggested, a weak and submissive creature meant to serve the stronger members of the pack. But appearances could be deceiving. You have gentle hands. Seraphina looked up to find Garrett watching her with something like wonder in his pain-glazed eyes. My grandmother taught me. She kept her voice steady as she applied a poultice to his wounds. She believed that healing was as important as fighting. A wise woman. She was. Seraphina secured the bandage with careful precision. Now I need you to rest. Your body needs time to repair itself. Will I live? The question was asked without fear. Garrett's eyes were clear, accepting. He was a warrior, Seraphina realized. He had faced death before and was not afraid of it. Yes. She surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. You will live. I will make sure of it. Something flickered in his expression. Gratitude, perhaps? Or hope. Thank you. He closed his eyes. What did you say your name was? Serafina. Most people call me Sarah. Sarah. The word was barely a whisper. A beautiful name. She watched him drift into an exhausted sleep, his breathing gradually steadying as the herbs took effect. Around her, the small cottage that served as the village's healing house was crowded with injured men. Her sister Mira moved between the beds, changing bandages and offering water to those who could drink. Mira was 30 years old, a beta who had been widowed 3 years ago when her husband died in a hunting accident. She had a young son named Thomas, who was currently staying with neighbors, far from the blood and suffering that filled their home. Unlike Serafina, Mira was practical and straightforward, with none of their grandmother's mysterious ways. She approached now, her face drawn with exhaustion. How is he? He will survive. Sarah wiped her hands on a clean cloth, but he will need weeks of rest before he can travel. We do not have weeks. Mira's voice dropped to a whisper. The riders from Ravencrest arrive tomorrow. They will want to question the survivors. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Why? Because these attacks are not random. Mira glanced at the sleeping warriors, making sure none were conscious enough to hear. Something is happening, Sarah. Something big. The kingdom is afraid, and when kingdoms are afraid, they look for someone to blame. The riders from Ravencrest arrived the following morning. There were 6 of them, led by a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire village square. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. His armor bore the insignia of the royal guard, marking him as one of the elite warriors sworn to protect the king and his family. Commander Victor Blackwood. Sarah knew the name, though she had never met the man. Everyone in Ravencrest knew of Victor Blackwood. His father had been a traitor, executed 15 years ago for crimes against the crown. Victor had spent his entire adult life trying to erase that stain, rising through the ranks of the guard through a combination of skill, brutality, and unwavering loyalty to the king. Or so the story said. Looking at him now, Sarah felt her grandmother's warnings echo in her mind. Trust your instincts, the old woman had said. They will tell you more than words ever could. Her instincts were screaming. Victor's gaze swept across the gathered villagers with cold efficiency, cataloging faces and measuring threats. When his eyes found Sarah, standing at the edge of the crowd in her simple healer's dress, something flickered in their depths. Recognition, perhaps, or interest. Neither option was comforting. I am here on behalf of King Aldrich. Victor's voice carried easily across the silent square. We have received reports of an attack on a border patrol near this village. I require information about the survivors and the nature of their injuries. The village elder, a wizened man named Crawford, stepped forward. We have given the wounded shelter, Commander. Our healer has been treating them. Your healer? Victor's attention sharpened. Show me. Sarah felt her sister's hand close around her arm in warning, but it was too late. The villagers were already parting, creating a path between her and the commander. She had no choice but to step forward. Victor studied her for a long moment. You are the healer. It was not a question. Yes, Commander. And you have been treating the wounded soldiers? To the best of my ability. Come with me. Victor turned toward the healing house. I wish to examine the wounded and hear your assessment of their injuries. She followed him across the square, acutely aware of the curious and fearful gazes that tracked their progress. The healing house was quiet when they entered, the injured warriors either sleeping or too weak to acknowledge their visitor. Victor moved between the beds with professional detachment, examining each patient with the eye of someone who had seen many wounds in his lifetime. He stopped beside Garrett's bed. This one seems better than the others. He arrived in the worst condition. Sarah kept her voice neutral. But he is young and strong. His body is responding well to treatment. What treatment exactly? Sarah hesitated. There were aspects of her grandmother's techniques that she had never shared with anyone. Methods that went beyond ordinary healing into something older and stranger. Something that would invite questions she could not afford to answer. Herbal poultices for infection. She listed the ingredients with clinical precision. Bone setting for the collarbone. Rest and careful monitoring. Victor was watching her with unsettling intensity. And that is all? What else would there be? The question hung between them, loaded with implication. Victor's eyes dropped to her hands, still stained with traces of the herbs she had been grinding that morning. Then they rose to her face, studying her features with something that looked almost like recognition. "You have an unusual appearance for an Omega." The words were casual, almost conversational, but Sarah sensed the trap beneath them. "My grandmother had similar coloring. It runs in our family." "Your grandmother?" Victor's expression gave nothing away. "She was the healer here before you?" "Yes." "And where did she learn her skills?" Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This line of questioning was leading somewhere dangerous. She needed to deflect it without appearing to do so. She never spoke much about her past. Sarah met Victor's gaze steadily. "She taught me what I needed to know to help our village. That is all." For a moment, she thought Victor would press further. His eyes narrowed slightly, and she could see the calculation working behind them. He knew she was hiding something. The question was whether he cared enough to pursue it. Then the door to the healing house burst open. "Commander!" One of Victor's soldiers stood in the doorway, breathless from running. "We have received a message from Ravencrest. The prince has summoned all border officers to the capital. The council is meeting, and you are required to attend." Victor's expression shifted, some internal calculation recalculating in light of this new information. He looked at Sarah one more time, that penetrating gaze weighing possibilities. "You will come to Ravencrest as well." Sarah felt her blood turn cold. "I do not understand." "The survivors will need continued treatment during their recovery, and I wish to present your testimony about their injuries to the council." Victor's smile did not reach his eyes. "Consider it an honor. It is not often that a village healer is invited to the capital." It was not a request. The journey to Ravencrest took 3 days. Sarah traveled in a covered wagon with the surviving warriors, continuing their treatment as the rough roads jostled their injured bodies. Victor rode at the head of the column, his dark figure a constant presence that she could feel even when she could not see him. Her sister had begged her not to go. Mira had wept and argued and finally fallen silent, her face pale with a fear she could not name. She had pressed their grandmother's silver pendant into Sarah's hands at the moment of departure, the crescent moon embracing a tiny star that had been in their family for generations. "Wear it hidden." Mira's voice had been fierce with urgency. "Do not let anyone see it. And be careful, Sarah. Be very careful." Sarah touched the pendant now, feeling its cool weight against her skin beneath the fabric of her dress. Her grandmother had called it a symbol of their heritage, a connection to something older than memory. She had never explained what that heritage was. She had only warned Sarah to keep it secret, always hidden, always afraid. Ravencrest appeared on the horizon as the sun began to set on the 3rd day. The fortress rose from the snow-covered landscape like a dream made stone, its towers reaching toward the darkening sky. Lights flickered in countless windows, and even from this distance, Sarah could sense the power that radiated from its walls. This was the seat of the Wolf Kingdom, the home of the Ravencrest bloodline for 300 years, a place of legend and terror, of glory and blood. And somewhere within those ancient walls, the silent prince waited. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had heard the stories. Prince Caspian, the heir to the throne, struck mute by an assassin's blade. A broken prince for a fading kingdom, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Ravencrest in recent years. But looking at the fortress now, watching the torchlight dance against the stone, Sarah felt something stir in her chest. Her grandmother's gift, responding to something she could not see. An awareness of presence, of power, of destiny waiting to unfold. Something was about to change. She did not know if that change would save her or destroy her. She only knew that she could not turn back. Whatever waited for her in Ravencrest, she would face it with open eyes and steady hands, like her grandmother had taught her, like the last daughter of the crescent moon. The great hall of Ravencrest was larger than the entire village she had left behind. Sarah stood at the edge of the council chamber, trying to make herself invisible among the guards and servants who lined the walls. Victor had brought her here to give testimony about the wounded soldiers, but she sensed that her true purpose was something else entirely. She was being watched. The council members sat around a massive oak table, their faces grim with worry and suspicion. King Aldrich presided from his throne at the head of the table, his presence commanding despite the weariness etched into his features. He was older than she had expected, his hair more gray than black, his shoulders bowed beneath the weight of invisible burdens. But it was the figure to the king's left who captured her attention. Prince Caspian. He sat perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on the proceedings with an intensity that seemed almost physical. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps a few years older than herself, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and a face that might have been handsome if not for the scar that traced a pale line from his temple to his throat. The wound that had stolen his voice. As she watched, the prince's gaze shifted slightly. Their eyes met across the crowded chamber, and Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Something passed between them in that instant. Recognition, though they had never met. Understanding, though no words had been spoken. A connection that defied explanation. Then the moment passed. The prince looked away, his attention returning to the council member who was speaking. Sarah released a breath she had not realized she was holding. What had just happened? The council member was describing the attacks on the border, listing casualties and property damage with the detached precision of someone reading from a ledger. Sarah barely heard the words. Her grandmother's gift was humming beneath her skin, responding to the prince's presence with an intensity she had never experienced. He was different. She did not know how she knew this, but the certainty was absolute. Beneath his silence, beneath his stillness, something powerful waited, something that the rest of the council could not see. And then she saw something else. It happened in an instant. The old man, Elder Brennan, shifted his position slightly as he listened to the report. It was a subtle movement, almost unconscious, but to Sarah's trained eyes, it spoke volumes. His shoulders had tightened at the mention of a specific location. His fingers had twitched when a particular name was mentioned. His eyes had flickered just for a moment toward the prince with an expression that was not loyalty. It was calculation. It was hatred. It was the look of someone who was hiding something terrible behind a mask of respectability. Sarah felt her heart begin to pound. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of the rogues who had attacked her village years ago, in the eyes of the hunters who had eventually killed them. It was the look of a predator preparing to strike, and it was directed at the prince. She wanted to cry out, to warn him somehow, but she was just a village healer, an Omega with no voice in these proceedings. Speaking out of turn would mean punishment, perhaps death. She would be dismissed as hysterical, as delusional, as another foolish woman who did not know her place. But the prince was watching her again. His amber eyes had found hers across the chamber, and in them she saw a question. Had she noticed something? Did she understand? Without thinking, without planning, Sarah raised her hands and made a small gesture. It was nothing that the council members would recognize, just a subtle movement of her fingers, a pattern that her grandmother had taught her years ago. The old language, the silent speech, the way of the crescent moon. Danger. The sign meant danger. Close, hidden. The prince's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. His gaze flickered toward Elder Brennan for just a fraction of a second, then returned to Sarah with a new intensity. He had understood. Somehow, impossibly, he had understood. And in that moment, standing in the great hall of Ravencrest surrounded by wolves who would destroy her if they knew what she was, Sarah realized that everything her grandmother had told her was true. The old ways were not dead. The silent language still lived, and the prince who could not speak might be the only one who could truly hear. The council meeting ended without resolution. The attacks were discussed and debated. Blame was assigned and deflected. Plans were proposed and rejected. Through it all, Sarah stood at the edge of the chamber, watching the dance of power and deception with new understanding. Victor approached her as the council members began to disperse. "Your testimony was not required after all." His voice held a note of disappointment. The council was more interested in politics than in wounded soldiers. "I understand, Commander." "Do you?" Victor's eyes narrowed. "I wonder sometimes what you understand, healer, and what you are hiding." Before Sarah could respond, a servant appeared at her elbow. "The prince requests your presence in the library." The words were delivered in a tone that brooked no argument. "He wishes to discuss the treatment of the wounded soldiers." Victor's expression flickered with something unreadable. "The prince rarely requests private audiences. Perhaps he wishes to learn about healing." Sarah kept her voice carefully neutral. "I am happy to serve however I can." She followed the servant through winding corridors and up narrow staircases, leaving Victor and his suspicions behind. The library was located in one of the older towers, a circular room filled with books and scrolls that stretched from floor to ceiling. Candles flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the ancient texts. Prince Caspian stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. He turned as she entered, and once again Sarah felt that strange connection snap into place between them. They were alone. The prince raised his hands and began to sign. "You know the silent language." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had not expected him to communicate so directly, so immediately. But she responded in kind, her hands forming the words her grandmother had taught her. "My grandmother taught me. She said it was the old way." The old way. Something flickered in his amber eyes. "My mother knew it as well. She taught me before she died." Sarah felt her heart constrict with unexpected sympathy. "I am sorry for your loss. And I am sorry for whatever brought you here." Caspian's signs were precise, elegant, the movements of someone who had spent years perfecting a skill that no one else valued. "But you saw something in the council chamber, something that disturbed you." It was not a question. Sarah hesitated. She was standing at a crossroads, and she knew it. If she told him what she had seen, she would be involving herself in court politics far beyond her understanding. She would be making enemies of powerful men. She would be risking everything. But if she stayed silent, she would be betraying the truth. And her grandmother had taught her that some truths were worth any price. The old man, Elder Brennan. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she signed. "There is something wrong about him, something hidden. I cannot explain how I know this, but I am certain of it." Caspian studied her for a long moment. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that took her breath away. "You see things that others cannot see." "Yes, it is a gift, or a curse. My grandmother called it the gift of the crescent moon." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Sarah saw recognition flash across Caspian's features. Then something else, something that looked almost like hope. The crescent moon. His hands moved slowly, deliberately. "My mother spoke of them. She said they were healers and seers, beings of great power who were hunted to extinction." "Not extinction!" Sarah touched the hidden pendant beneath her dress. "My grandmother was one of them, and she passed her knowledge to me." The prince moved closer, close enough that she could see the individual flecks of gold in his amber eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Then you are exactly what I have been searching for." The words sent a shiver down her spine. "I do not understand." "Someone in this court is a traitor." Caspian's signs were urgent now, filled with barely contained emotion. "Someone arranged the attacks on our borders. Someone is working to destroy my family and claim the throne for themselves. I have been investigating for 5 years, building a network of informants and gathering evidence, but I am limited by my silence. I cannot speak to reveal what I know. I cannot accuse without proof that others can hear." "And you think I can help?" "I think you can see what I cannot." His eyes held hers with desperate intensity. "I think together we might find the truth before it is too late." Sarah looked at this silent prince, this broken heir to a fading kingdom. She saw the determination beneath his calm exterior. She saw the intelligence that his enemies mistook for vacancy. She saw a man who had been fighting alone for 5 years and who was finally, desperately, reaching out for an ally. She saw herself reflected in his isolation. "My grandmother warned me to keep my gifts hidden." Her signs were steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "She said that revealing myself would mean death." "Your grandmother was wise." Caspian's expression softened. "And she was right to be afraid. But sometimes the only way forward is through the fire. Will you help me, Seraphina of the Crescent Moon?" He knew her name. He knew her heritage. He was offering her a chance to step out of the shadows and into a battle that could destroy everything she had ever known. She thought of her grandmother, dying in her small cottage with secrets still locked behind her lips. She thought of her sister, weeping at the edge of the village as she departed for Ravencrest. She thought of the wounded soldiers in the healing house, victims of a conflict they did not understand. And she thought of the old man, Elder Brennan, with hatred hidden behind his ancient eyes. Some truths were worth any price. "Yes." Sarah met the prince's gaze without flinching. "I will help you." The word sealed her fate. Outside the tower window, the winter wind howled across the battlements of Ravencrest, carrying with it the scent of snow and steel and the distant promise of war. The kingdom was fracturing, its foundations crumbling beneath the weight of betrayal and ambition. But in the flickering candlelight of the ancient library, 2 souls had found each other in the silence, and together they would face whatever darkness was coming. The game had begun. 3 weeks had passed since Seraphina arrived at Ravencrest, and in that time the world she knew had transformed beyond recognition. She no longer slept in the cramped healing house of her village, surrounded by the moans of wounded soldiers and the sharp scent of medicinal herbs. Instead, she occupied a chamber in the eastern wing of the fortress, a room larger than her entire cottage back home, with windows that overlooked the snow-covered mountains and a fireplace that burned day and night against the winter cold. The transformation had not been gradual. It had come like an avalanche, sudden and overwhelming, sweeping away everything familiar and leaving her standing in a landscape she barely recognized. Prince Caspian had moved quickly after their meeting in the library. Within days of their secret conversation, he had presented her to the council as his official interpreter and advisor on medical matters. The announcement had sent shockwaves through the court. An Omega in a position of royal authority, a village healer elevated to the status of courtier, a stranger granted access to the innermost circles of power. The objections had been immediate and fierce. Elder Brennan had spoken against it with cold precision, citing tradition and precedent, and the dangers of allowing unknown elements into sensitive discussions. Lord Harwick had expressed concerns about propriety and the reactions of neighboring kingdoms. Lady Frost had simply stared at Sarah with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential prey. But the king had supported his son's decision. Sarah still remembered the moment when Aldrich Ravencrest had risen from his throne and silenced the council with a single raised hand. His voice had been tired but firm as he spoke the words that changed her fate. "My son has chosen his interpreter. I will not question his judgment." The words had carried the weight of royal decree, and the council had been forced to accept what they could not change. But acceptance was not the same as approval. Sarah felt their hostility like a physical pressure against her skin every time she entered a room. The whispers that followed her through the corridors, the cold shoulders and cutting remarks, the constant unspoken question in every pair of eyes. Who was she really, and what did she want? She asked herself the same questions in the quiet hours of the night, lying awake in her unfamiliar bed while the fire crackled and shadows danced across the stone walls. She had come to Ravencrest as a witness, a healer summoned to give testimony about wounded soldiers. Now she stood at the right hand of the Silent Prince, privy to secrets that could shake the kingdom to its foundations. The investigation had consumed their days and nights. Caspian's network of informants stretched throughout the fortress and beyond, a web of servants and minor nobles and common soldiers who reported to him through carefully established channels. He shared this information with Sarah in the privacy of the library, their hands moving in the silent language that had become their shared tongue. The attacks on the borders were not random. They were coordinated strikes designed to weaken Ravencrest's defenses and drain its resources. The rogues who carried out the assaults were not ordinary bandits, but trained mercenaries, hired and directed by someone with intimate knowledge of the kingdom's vulnerabilities. Someone inside the court. Caspian suspected Brennan. The old man had served 3 generations of Ravencrest kings, accumulating power and influence that extended into every corner of the administration. His network of loyalists held positions throughout the military and civil service. If anyone had the means to orchestrate such a conspiracy, it was him. But suspicion was not proof, and without proof, they were helpless to act. The morning brought news that would complicate everything. Sarah stood beside Caspian in the Great Hall as the herald announced the arrival of a diplomatic delegation from the southern kingdom of Valdris. The hall fell silent as the massive doors swung open, revealing a procession of warriors and courtiers in the crimson and gold colors of the southern realm. At their head walked a woman who commanded attention simply by existing. Queen Lysandra of Valdris was 35 years old, tall and striking, with dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders like a river of midnight silk. Her features were sharp and aristocratic, her eyes the pale gray of winter storms. She moved with the fluid grace of a natural predator, every step radiating power and confidence. She was beautiful. She was dangerous, and according to the whispers that preceded her arrival, she had come to Ravencrest with a very specific purpose: marriage. "King Aldrich!" Lysandra's voice rang through the hall like a bell, clear and commanding. "I bring greetings from Valdris and an offer of alliance that will benefit both our kingdoms." Aldrich rose from his throne, his expression carefully neutral. "Queen Lysandra, Ravencrest welcomes you and your delegation. Please join us for refreshments while your people are shown to their quarters." The formalities continued, an elaborate dance of diplomatic courtesy that Sarah observed with growing unease. Her grandmother's gift hummed beneath her skin, responding to the currents of intention and deception that swirled through the hall like invisible smoke. Lysandra was not here simply to propose an alliance. There was something else, something hidden beneath the surface of her gracious smiles and carefully chosen words. Sarah could feel it, though she could not name it. And then she saw him. Walking 2 steps behind the queen was a man whose presence seemed to fade into the background despite his considerable height. He was handsome in a forgettable way, with brown hair and brown eyes and features that slipped from memory almost as soon as you looked away. He wore the simple robes of a scholar or advisor, unmarked by any insignia of rank. But when his gaze swept across the hall and found Sarah, something flickered in those unremarkable eyes. Recognition, assessment. A flash of interest quickly concealed behind a mask of bland indifference. Sarah felt cold fingers walk down her spine. "Who is that man?" She signed the question to Caspian, her movements small and discreet. The prince's amber eyes tracked to the figure in question, and his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dorian," he signed back, "the queen's personal advisor and interpreter. He speaks many languages, including the silent tongue." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Lysandra had brought her own interpreter for Caspian, someone who could translate his signs without relying on Sarah, someone who could potentially replace her, rendering her position unnecessary. It was a political move, elegant and ruthless. If Caspian was forced to use Dorian as his interpreter, Lysandra would have a direct line into his thoughts and communications. She would know everything he said, everything he planned, everything he revealed in unguarded moments, and Sarah would be cast aside, her brief elevation to power ending as suddenly as it had begun. Caspian's hand found hers beneath the folds of their formal robes, a brief squeeze of reassurance. His eyes met hers with fierce determination. She will not succeed. The welcoming feast that evening was a battlefield disguised as a celebration. Sarah sat at the high table for the first time, occupying a position beside Caspian that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. The placement was deliberate, a statement of her status that forced the court to acknowledge her presence. She felt every hostile gaze like needles against her skin, but she kept her chin high and her expression serene. Lysandra sat across from them, resplendent in a gown of crimson silk that left her shoulders bare despite the winter chill. Dorian hovered at her elbow, his bland face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Prince Caspian." Lysandra's voice carried easily over the noise of the feast. "I have heard much about you. They say you are a warrior of considerable skill, despite your unfortunate condition." The word hung in the air, poisonous in its false sympathy. Sarah felt her hands clench beneath the table, but Caspian's expression remained perfectly calm. He turned to her and signed, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Tell Her Majesty that I appreciate her interest in my capabilities, and remind her that silence is not the same as weakness." Sarah translated, her voice steady despite the anger burning in her chest. Lysandra's smile did not waver, but something cold flickered in her gray eyes. "How charming that you have found an interpreter." She gestured toward Dorian. "I brought my own, of course. Dorian is fluent in the silent language. I thought it might be helpful during our negotiations." The offer was transparent in its implications. Caspian could accept Dorian as his translator, granting Lysandra a conduit into his private communications. Or he could refuse, insulting the queen and jeopardizing the proposed alliance. It was a trap with no good escape. But Caspian had anticipated this moment. His hands moved with calm authority as he signed his response. "Serafina is not merely my interpreter. She is my royal advisor on medicine and communication, appointed by my father, the king. Her position is not subject to diplomatic convenience." Lysandra's eyes narrowed as Sarah translated. The queen glanced at King Aldrich, seated at the head of the table, clearly expecting him to contradict his son's claim. But Aldrich only nodded, his weathered face impassive. "My son speaks truthfully. Serafina holds an official position in our court. We would no more ask you to dismiss your advisors than you would ask us to dismiss ours." The words were delivered with the casual authority of a king who had spent decades navigating political waters far more treacherous than this. Lysandra's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment the mask of diplomatic grace slipped to reveal something harder beneath. "Of course," her voice remained pleasant, but the warmth had drained from it. "I meant no offense. I simply wished to ensure that communication between our parties would be as clear as possible." The feast continued, but the battle lines had been drawn. Sarah felt Caspian's hand brush against hers beneath the table, a brief touch of solidarity that sent warmth spreading through her chest. They had won the first skirmish, but the war was far from over. Later that night, after the guests had retired and the great hall had emptied, Sarah made her way through the quiet corridors toward her chamber. The torches had burned low, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her as she walked. She was so lost in thought that she almost collided with the figure who stepped out of a side passage. King Aldrich. The ruler of Ravencrest looked smaller somehow in the dim light, the weight of his years and burdens visible in the stoop of his shoulders and the lines carved deep into his face. He wore simple clothes rather than his formal robes, and his gray hair was disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. "Your Majesty." Sarah dropped into a curtsy, her heart racing with sudden alarm. "I apologize. I did not see you." "No need for apologies." Aldrich's voice was tired but kind. "I was hoping to speak with you, actually. Walk with me?" It was not a request she could refuse. Sarah fell into step beside the king as he led her through a series of passages she had never explored, ascending a narrow staircase that emerged onto a small balcony overlooking the inner courtyard. The night sky blazed with stars, and the snow below glowed silver in the moonlight. It was beautiful and cold, a reminder of how harsh this land could be beneath its moments of splendor. "My son trusts you." Aldrich spoke without preamble, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I am honored by his trust." "He does not trust easily." The king's voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. "I taught him that, though not intentionally. After his mother died, I withdrew from him. I could not look at him without seeing her face, hearing her voice. The scar on his throat reminded me of everything I failed to protect." Sarah remained silent, sensing that the king needed to speak more than he needed a response. "I told myself it was for his own good. That distance would make him stronger, more independent. That he needed to learn to stand alone if he was going to rule someday." Aldrich shook his head slowly. "I was a coward. I wrapped my grief in duty and called it wisdom, but it was cowardice all the same." "Your Majesty, I am telling you this because I need you to understand something." The king turned to face her, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "My son has been alone for 5 years, fighting battles that I should have helped him fight, building alliances that I should have supported, preparing for a war that I was too blind to see coming." "A war?" "Someone in this kingdom wants to destroy the Ravencrest bloodline." Aldrich's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Caspian knows it, he has known it for years, and instead of standing beside him, I left him to face it alone." The confession hung in the cold air between them, raw and painful. Sarah saw the king in a new light, not as the powerful ruler she had feared, but as a father consumed by guilt and desperate to make amends. "What do you want me to do?" "Help him." Aldrich reached into his coat and withdrew something that gleamed in the moonlight. A seal, heavy and golden, carved with the symbols of the Ravencrest house. "This is the War Seal. It grants authority to command our armies in times of crisis. I am giving it to Caspian tomorrow, publicly, before the entire court." Sarah stared at the seal, understanding the magnitude of what the king was saying. This was not merely a symbol of military authority. It was a declaration of succession, a statement to the kingdom and to their enemies that Caspian was the undisputed heir to the throne. And it was a target painted on the prince's back. "The Queen of Valdres will not be pleased." "No, she will not." Aldrich's smile was grim. "But I am done playing safe. I am done hiding from the truth. My son is ready to lead, and it is time the world knew it." He pressed the seal into Sarah's hands. "Give this to him. Tell him that his father finally sees what he should have seen all along. Tell him that I am proud of the man he has become." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back, struggling to maintain her composure. "Why are you giving this to me? Why not tell him yourself?" "Because I have spent 5 years failing to say the words that matter." Aldrich's voice cracked slightly. "I do not trust myself to say them now, but you can speak for me in a way that I cannot. That is what you do, is it not? Give voice to those who have none?" The question pierced her heart with its simple truth. She had spent her whole life hiding, concealing her gifts, suppressing her voice to survive in a world that did not value what she had to offer. Now she was being asked to speak for a king to his son, to bridge a gap that 5 years of silence had created. "I will tell him. Thank you." Aldrich stepped back, his figure diminishing in the shadows. And Serafina? Be careful. The enemy is closer than any of us realized. I feel it in my bones, the way you feel a storm approaching before the first clouds appear. He turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone on the balcony with the weight of the seal heavy in her hands and the weight of his words heavier still in her heart. The attack came that very night. Sarah was still awake, sitting in her chamber and turning the war seal over in her hands, when the sound of steel on steel shattered the silence. She was on her feet instantly, her grandmother's training taking over as she assessed the situation with cold clarity. Shouts echoed through the corridors. The clash of weapons grew louder, and then a sound that turned her blood to ice. The king. Someone was screaming, "They have attacked the king." She ran. The corridors were chaos. Servants fled in panic. Guards rushed toward the royal quarters with swords drawn. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled in rage or pain. Sarah pushed through the confusion, following the sounds of combat toward the king's chambers. She rounded a corner and nearly stumbled over a body sprawled across the stones. A guard, his throat torn out, his dead eyes staring at the ceiling. She kept running. The doors to the king's quarters hung open, one of them torn completely from its hinges. Inside, the chamber was a scene of devastation. Furniture overturned, tapestries torn from the walls, blood splattered across the ancient stones. And in the center of it all, King Aldrich sat slumped against his bed, a wound in his shoulder seeping crimson through his nightclothes. General Marcus Thorne knelt beside him, pressing a cloth against the injury while barking orders at the guards who surrounded them. "The assassin." Sarah's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Where is the assassin?" "Dead." Marcus jerked his head toward a dark shape crumpled in the corner. "I arrived just in time. Another moment and—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Sarah crossed to the king's side, her healer's instincts taking over. The wound was deep, but not fatal. The blade had missed the major vessels by inches. With proper care, he would survive. But that was not what made her hands tremble as she examined the injury. It was the symbol carved into the assassin's flesh, a crescent moon embracing a star. Her grandmother's symbol, the mark of the crescent moon. "General," her voice was barely a whisper. "Look at this." Marcus moved to examine the body, his weathered face hardening as he saw the mark. The crescent moon. He spat the words like a curse. "They dare to strike at us directly?" But Sarah was not listening. She was staring at the corpse with her grandmother's gift wide open, reading the truth that lay beneath the surface of things. The assassin was wrong. She could not explain how she knew this, but the certainty was absolute. The body before her was not what it appeared to be. The proportions were subtly off. The scent was strange, a mixture of wolf and something else, and the symbol carved into the flesh was too precise, too deliberate, as if it had been placed there specifically to be found. This was not an attack by the crescent moon. This was an attack designed to look like one. Someone was framing them, framing her. "What is it?" Marcus was watching her with sharp eyes. "What do you see?" Before she could answer, the doors burst open once more. Caspian rushed in, his face pale with fear that transformed into relief when he saw his father alive. Behind him came Victor Blackwood, sword in hand, followed by a squad of royal guards. The next hours blurred together in a haze of activity. The king was treated and moved to a secure location. The assassin's body was examined by every expert in the fortress. The council assembled in emergency session, and accusations flew like arrows across the chamber. But through it all, Sarah kept returning to what she had seen, what she had felt. The wrongness of the assassin's body, the deliberate placement of the symbol, the overwhelming sense that they were all being manipulated by forces they could not see. She found Caspian in the library as dawn broke over Ravencrest. He sat alone at the great table, surrounded by papers and maps, his amber eyes red with exhaustion. When she entered, he looked up with an expression that made her heart ache. She crossed to him and began to sign, her movements urgent. The assassin was not what he appeared to be. The symbol was planted. "Someone is trying to blame the crescent moon for this attack." Caspian's brow furrowed. "How do you know?" "I cannot explain it fully, but I felt it. My grandmother's gift showed me the truth beneath the surface." Sarah's hands trembled with the intensity of her conviction. The assassin was not pure wolf. He was something else, something mixed. "Mixed? You mean a hybrid?" "I think so. Like me? Like the crescent moon were said to be, but different somehow. Wrong." Caspian was silent for a long moment, processing this information. Then his hands began to move with sudden energy. "Show me the body." They descended into the lower levels of the fortress, past the dungeons and storage chambers, to the cold room where the dead were kept before burial. The assassin's corpse lay on a stone slab, covered with a simple cloth. Sarah forced herself to approach, to push past the revulsion that rose in her throat at the sight of death laid bare. She pulled back the cloth and began her examination with clinical precision, narrating her findings to Caspian through the silent language. "The bone structure is wrong. The proportions do not match a pure wolf. And here, look at the fingers. The nails are too long, too curved. These are not natural features. They have been enhanced somehow." Caspian studied the corpse with the same intensity, his eyes missing nothing. "And the symbol? Carved post-mortem." Sarah pointed to the wound. "See how the edges are clean? How there is no inflammation? This was done after death, not before. Someone wanted us to find this mark. Someone wanted us to blame the crescent moon." "Yes." Sarah met his gaze. "Someone who knows about my heritage. Someone who wants to discredit me and remove me from your side." The realization hung between them, terrible and clarifying. This was not merely an assassination attempt. This was a move in a larger game, a deliberate manipulation designed to achieve multiple objectives at once. Kill the king, frame the crescent moon, destroy Sarah's credibility, isolate Caspian. The enemy was not just powerful, they were brilliant. "We need to search this body more thoroughly." Caspian's hands moved with renewed purpose. If someone went to this much trouble to plant false evidence, they may have left real evidence as well. They searched for over an hour, examining every inch of the corpse with painstaking care. Just as Sarah was beginning to lose hope, Caspian made a sound of triumph. He had found something hidden in the lining of the assassin's boot, a small piece of paper, folded tight and sealed with wax. The seal bore an unfamiliar symbol. Not the crescent moon. Something else. Sarah broke the seal and unfolded the paper, her breath catching as she saw what was written there. It was a code, symbols arranged in patterns that made no sense at first glance. But as she studied them, recognition dawned like the sun breaking through clouds. "I know this." Her hands shook as she signed. "This is based on the silent language. My grandmother taught me this cipher as a child." "Can you read it?" She stared at the symbols, her mind racing to recall lessons learned decades ago. The cipher was complex, layered, designed to be understood only by those who knew both the silent language and the specific key that unlocked its meaning. But she had been trained by the best. Her grandmother had prepared her for exactly this moment, even if neither of them had known it at the time. "It says," Sarah translated slowly, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "Phase 2 prepared. Target confirmed. Winter solstice. The insider will open the gate." "Winter solstice." Caspian's face had gone pale. "That is in 5 days. 5 days. 5 days until whatever attack the enemy had planned would be launched. 5 days to identify the traitor, shore up their defenses, and prevent what could be the destruction of everything they held dear. "There is more." Sarah continued reading, her voice faltering as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "The message mentions multiple targets. The king, you, and someone called the last daughter." "The last daughter." Caspian's eyes met hers with terrible understanding. "They mean you. They know what you are. They know about the crescent moon." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had spent her entire life hiding, concealing her heritage, pretending to be nothing more than a simple healer. And somehow, impossibly, the enemy had seen through all of it. They knew. And in 5 days, they were coming to finish what they had started generations ago, to destroy the crescent moon once and for all, to kill her along with the royal family, to end the Ravencrest bloodline and seize power in the chaos that followed. "We have to tell your father." Sarah's signs were frantic. "We have to warn the council." "No." Caspian caught her hands, stilling their movement. "We do not know who the insider is. If we reveal what we have learned to the wrong person, we will only warn the enemy that we are on to them." "Then what do? We investigate, we gather evidence, and we set a trap of our own." The days that followed were the most intense of Sarah's life. She and Caspian worked in secret, pursuing leads and gathering information while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. The council remained focused on the assassination attempt, debating security measures and assigning blame in equal measure. Queen Lysandra continued her diplomatic overtures, her proposals for alliance growing more aggressive as the winter solstice approached. And through it all, Sarah felt the weight of suspicion pressing down on her from every direction. Elder Brennan had seized upon the crescent moon symbol with barely concealed satisfaction. He delivered lengthy speeches to the council about the dangers of allowing unknown elements into positions of trust, his ancient eyes finding Sarah with each pointed remark. Lord Harwick and Lady Frost nodded along, their expressions hungry for any excuse to remove the Omega who had risen so far above her station. Even Victor Blackwood watched her with new intensity, his dark gaze following her movements through the corridors with predatory attention. She could not tell if he suspected her of complicity in the attack or simply disliked her presence in the court. Either way, his scrutiny added another layer of tension to an already impossible situation. Only Caspian remained constant. In the stolen hours they spent together in the library, poring over documents and analyzing evidence, he never wavered in his trust. His hands spoke words of encouragement and determination, his amber eyes blazing with a fire that warmed her even as the winter cold seeped through the stones. "I believe in you." He signed this on the third night, when exhaustion had worn them both down to their essential selves. Not because of what you can do, because of who you are. She wanted to weep at the simple sincerity of his words. No one had ever believed in her like this. Not even her grandmother, who had spent her life preparing Sarah for dangers she could never fully explain. "What if we fail?" Her hands trembled as she formed the signs. "What if we cannot find the traitor in time?" "Then we fight." Caspian's expression was fierce. "We fight with everything we have, and we do not stop until the enemy is defeated or we are dead. That is what it means to be Ravencrest. That is what it means to be alive." He reached out and took her hands in his, stilling their movement. The touch sent warmth flooding through her, a connection that went deeper than words or signs. "I have been alone for 5 years." His eyes held hers with devastating honesty, fighting shadows, doubting myself, wondering if I would ever find someone who could truly understand. And then you appeared, speaking the language I thought only the dead remembered. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. She blinked them back, struggling to maintain her composure. "I was alone too." The words came hard, forced past the barrier she had built around her heart. "Hiding what I was. Pretending to be less than I am. Terrified that someone would discover the truth and destroy me for it. You do not have to hide anymore, not from me." The words hung between them, weighted with promise and possibility. For a moment, the world outside the library ceased to exist. There was only this room, this man, this connection that defied every law of their society. Then a knock at the door shattered the moment. They sprang apart as the door swung open to reveal the last person Sarah expected to see. Victor Blackwood. The captain of the guard stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. His eyes moved from Caspian to Sarah and back again, noting their proximity with visible interest. "My prince," his voice was carefully neutral, "I apologize for the interruption, but there is something you need to see." "What is it?" Victor glanced at Sarah, hesitation flickering across his features. Then he seemed to reach a decision. "I know you suspect me." His words were blunt, stripped of diplomatic pretense. "You have been watching me since the assassination attempt, monitoring my movements, testing my loyalty with false information." Caspian's expression gave nothing away, but Sarah felt him tense beside her. "I do not deny it." The prince's hands moved with measured calm. "Given your father's history, suspicion was warranted. My father was a traitor." Victor's jaw tightened, old pain visible beneath his controlled exterior. "He betrayed everything our family had sworn to protect, and I have spent my entire life trying to erase that stain, to prove that I am not him." "I know. Then know this as well." Victor stepped further into the room, lowering his voice. "I have been conducting my own investigation, following leads that I could not share with the council because I did not know who to trust." "And what have you found?" "Evidence." Victor's dark eyes gleamed with barely suppressed intensity. "Evidence that points to the true traitor. Evidence that you need to see before the winter solstice." Sarah felt her heart begin to race. This was either a breakthrough or a trap. There was no way to know which until they had seen what Victor had to show them. Caspian seemed to reach the same conclusion. His hands moved in a quick sign to Sarah. "We follow him, but stay alert." She nodded imperceptibly, and together they followed Victor out of the library and into the darkened corridors of the fortress. Victor led them to a part of the castle that Sarah had never visited, a wing that had been sealed off decades ago after a fire had damaged the structure. They passed through locked doors and dusty passages, descending staircases that groaned beneath their weight. Finally, they emerged into a small chamber lit by a single torch. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat boxes of documents, ledgers, personal effects. The archive of Victor's family. After my father was executed, I preserved everything. Victor's voice was hollow. I told myself I was looking for proof of his innocence. I spent years searching for something that would redeem his memory. And did you find it? No. Victor laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the stone walls. What I found was worse. I found proof that he was guilty, but more than that, I found proof that he was not working alone. He crossed to a shelf and retrieved a box, setting it on the single table that occupied the center of the room. My father kept records of everything. Names, dates, payments, a chronicle of his betrayal that he never bothered to destroy. Perhaps he thought no one would ever find it. Perhaps he did not care. Caspian moved to examine the contents of the box. Sarah followed, her gift humming with anticipation. The documents inside were old, the paper yellowed and brittle. But the writing was clear enough to read. Names and dates spanning years, payments received for services rendered, and at the center of it all, one name that appeared again and again. Brennan. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Your father was working with Elder Brennan? Not just working with. Victor's voice was dark with suppressed rage. My father was Brennan's instrument, his weapon. Every betrayal, every piece of information sold to our enemies, Brennan was behind it all. And when my father became a liability, Brennan arranged for his exposure and execution. To cover his own tracks. Exactly. Victor turned to face them fully. The old man has been manipulating this kingdom for decades. He killed your mother, my prince. He arranged the assassination attempt. And whatever is coming at the winter solstice, he is behind that too. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Brennan, the man who had spoken against her appointment. The man who had seized upon the crescent moon symbol with such satisfaction. The man who had been present at every crucial moment, guiding events with the subtle hand of a master puppeteer. But there is more. Victor pulled out another document, this one newer than the others. I have been following Brennan for weeks. Last night I observed him meeting in secret with someone from the Valdris delegation. Who? The one called Dorian, Queen Lysandra's interpreter. Sarah felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. Dorian, who had tried to replace her as Caspian's voice. Dorian, who watched everything with those bland, forgettable eyes. Dorian, who had access to both delegations and could move between them without suspicion. Lysandra is part of this. Perhaps. Victor's expression was grim. Or perhaps Dorian is playing his own game, using her resources for his own purposes. Either way, they are planning something for the winter solstice, and we have less than 2 days to stop them. The three of them stood in the dusty archive, surrounded by the evidence of decades of betrayal. Outside, the winter wind howled against the ancient stones of Ravencrest, carrying with it the promise of the storm to come. They had found the enemy. They had proof of his crimes. But Brennan was a master manipulator with countless allies throughout the court. Exposing him would not be simple. And with the winter solstice approaching, they were running out of time. Caspian's hands moved in the silent language, signing to Sarah with fierce determination. We set the trap tomorrow. We let them think their plan is proceeding, and when they make their move, we will be ready. Sarah translated for Victor, who nodded grimly. What do you need from me? Your loyalty. Caspian met the captain's eyes. Your sword, and your willingness to trust an Omega who sees what others cannot. Victor looked at Sarah for a long moment. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him. You have all three. The alliance was forged. The battle lines were drawn. And as the dawn of the winter solstice approached, the fate of Ravencrest hung in the balance. The game was entering its final phase, and somewhere in the shadows the enemy was watching, waiting, preparing to strike. But they were no longer facing a silent prince alone. They were facing a prince, a healer, and a captain united by truth and bound by purpose. And together they would not go quietly into the darkness. The dawn of the winter solstice broke cold and gray over Ravencrest, the sun struggling to pierce through clouds heavy with the promise of snow. Seraphina stood at her chamber window, watching the servants below scurry through the courtyard, like ants preparing for a storm they could sense but not see. In a few hours, the great hall would fill with nobles and dignitaries from across the 5 kingdoms. The winter solstice celebration was the most important event of the year, a night when alliances were forged and broken, when the powerful displayed their strength and the ambitious made their moves. And somewhere in that glittering assembly, the enemy would strike. She had not slept. None of them had. The night had been consumed by preparations, by whispered conferences in shadowed corners, by the quiet movement of loyal guards into strategic positions throughout the fortress. Caspian had planned everything with the precision of a master tactician, anticipating contingencies and preparing responses for scenarios that might never occur. But despite all their preparations, Sarah could not shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Enter. The door swung open to reveal her sister Mira, who had arrived at Ravencrest 2 days ago at Sarah's urgent request. The journey had been difficult, undertaken in secret to avoid drawing attention, but Mira had come without hesitation when she learned her sister needed her. Now she stood in the doorway, her practical face creased with worry. "You look terrible." "Thank you for that encouragement." Sarah managed a weak smile. "I feel terrible as well, so at least there is consistency." Mira crossed the room and took her sister's hands in her own, her grip warm and steadying. "Tell me again that this will work. Tell me that you are not walking into a trap that will destroy you." "I cannot tell you that." Sarah's voice was soft but steady. "I can only tell you that doing nothing would be worse. If we allow Brennan to succeed, everything our grandmother worked to protect will be lost." "Our grandmother is dead." Mira's voice cracked. "I do not want to lose you too." "You will not lose me." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. In truth, Sarah had no idea what the day would bring. She only knew that she could not turn back, could not hide, could not pretend that the danger did not exist. Her grandmother had spent a lifetime running from the past. Sarah would not make the same choice. She embraced her sister, holding tight for a long moment. "If something happens to me, take Thomas and go to the Northern Territories. There are people there who will shelter you, people who remember the old ways. Caspian will ensure you have safe passage. Nothing is going to happen to you. Promise me, Mira. Promise me you will take care of yourself and your son." Mira pulled back, tears streaming down her face. "I promise. But you have to promise me something too. Anything. Come back to us. Whatever happens today, find a way to survive." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. She kissed her sister's forehead and gently pushed her toward the door. "Go to your chamber. Stay there until someone comes for you. And whatever you hear, whatever happens, do not come out until it is safe." Mira left, her footsteps fading down the corridor. Sarah turned back to the window, watching the clouds gather and darken over the mountains. The storm was coming, and she would face it head-on. The great hall had been transformed for the celebration. Thousands of candles blazed from chandeliers and wall sconces, their light dancing off gilded decorations and precious gems. Long tables groaned under the weight of elaborate feasts, and musicians played in the gallery above, filling the air with melodies that seemed to mock the tension Sarah felt coiling in her stomach. She stood beside Caspian on the raised dais at the head of the hall, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that had been provided for her by the royal household. The color marked her as a member of the prince's personal staff, a visual declaration of her position that drew stares and whispers from the assembled nobles. Let them whisper. She had more important concerns than the opinions of courtiers. Her eyes swept the crowd, cataloging faces and positions. Victor stood near the main doors, his guards positioned at key points around the perimeter. General Marcus commanded the contingent protecting the king, who sat on his throne with the war seal visible at his belt. And scattered throughout the hall were the members of Caspian's secret network, servants and minor nobles who watched and waited for the signal that would set everything in motion. Queen Lysandra occupied a place of honor at the high table, resplendent in crimson and gold. Dorian hovered at her shoulder as always, his bland face revealing nothing of his thoughts. And nearby, Elder Brennan sat among the other council members, his ancient eyes bright with anticipation. "He thinks he has won," Caspian signed to her, his movements small and discreet. "He believes his plan is unfolding exactly as designed. Let him believe it." Sarah's response was equally subtle. Overconfidence makes men careless. The feast began with the traditional toasts and speeches, an endless procession of nobles praising the king and pledging their loyalty to the Ravencrest throne. Sarah translated each one for Caspian, though she knew he understood most of what was being said. It was a performance, a display of normalcy, meant to lull the enemy into a false sense of security. Then Lysandra rose from her seat. The hall fell silent as the Queen of Valdres stepped forward, her gray eyes sweeping the assembly with imperious authority. She was magnificent in her arrogance, a woman who had never known defeat and could not imagine it. "King Aldrich." Her voice rang clear and strong. "On this night of celebration, I wish to make a formal proposal, one that will unite our kingdoms and ensure peace for generations to come." Aldrich inclined his head, his expression revealing nothing. "Speak, Queen Lysandra." Ravencrest listens. "I propose a marriage alliance between myself and Prince Caspian." Lysandra turned to face the prince directly, her smile sharp as a blade. "A union that will combine the strength of Valdres with the legacy of Ravencrest, creating a power that no enemy could challenge." The hall erupted in murmurs. Some nobles nodded approvingly at the prospect of such an alliance. Others exchanged worried glances, sensing the trap beneath the queen's honeyed words. Sarah felt Caspian tense beside her. This was the moment they had anticipated, the public challenge that Lysandra had been building toward since her arrival. To refuse would insult a powerful ally. To accept would place Caspian under her control. But they had prepared for this. Caspian rose from his seat, drawing every eye in the hall. He stood tall and straight, his amber eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to fill the room. Then his hands began to move, signing with deliberate precision. Sarah translated, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent chamber. "Queen Lysandra honors me with her proposal. The strength of Valdres is legendary, and any alliance between our kingdoms would indeed be formidable." Lysandra's smile widened, sensing victory. But Caspian was not finished. "However, I must respectfully decline." The smile froze on Lysandra's face. The murmurs in the hall intensified. Marriage between rulers should be built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Sarah continued to translate, her voice growing stronger with each word. "What you propose is not a partnership, but a conquest. You seek not an ally, but a puppet, a silent prince whose voice you would control through your own interpreter." Gasps rippled through the assembly. Lysandra's expression darkened, her mask of diplomatic grace crumbling. "You dare refuse me? I dare to choose my own path." Caspian's signs were fierce now, emphatic. "I am the heir to Ravencrest, and I will not surrender my voice to anyone. Not to you, not to your interpreters, not to anyone who would use my silence as a weapon against my own people." The hall had gone completely still. Even the musicians had stopped playing, their instruments hanging forgotten in their hands. Lysandra's eyes blazed with fury. "You will regret this, Prince. Valdres does not accept insults lightly, and Ravencrest does not bow to threats." Sarah felt a surge of fierce pride as she translated Caspian's final words. "If you came here seeking war, you will find us ready. If you came seeking an alliance of equals, then prove it through your actions, not your demands." For a moment, the tension in the hall was so thick it seemed to crackle like lightning before a storm. Lysandra and Caspian faced each other across the space between them, two powers colliding in a battle that had no swords but cut just as deep. Then a new voice shattered the silence. "Enough of this theater." Elder Brennan rose from his seat, his ancient face twisted with contempt. He moved toward the center of the hall with surprising speed for a man of his years, his robes swirling around him like shadows given form. "You speak of choices and paths, young prince, but you understand nothing of what is truly at stake here." Sarah felt cold dread flood through her veins. This was not part of their plan. Brennan was moving too soon, deviating from the script they had anticipated. "Elder Brennan," King Aldrich's voice was sharp with warning, "you forget yourself." "No, your majesty." Brennan turned to face the king, and in his eyes Sarah saw something terrible. "I remember everything, every slight, every betrayal. Every moment I was forced to serve a bloodline that should have ended generations ago." The guards around the room tensed, hands moving to weapons. But before they could act, the doors to the great hall burst open. Warriors in unfamiliar armor poured into the chamber, their swords already drawn. They wore no insignia, no colors that identified their allegiance, but they moved with the coordinated precision of a trained military force. Screams erupted from the assembled nobles. Tables overturned as people scrambled for safety. The musicians fled their gallery, their instruments crashing to the floor. And at the center of it all, Brennan raised his arms like a dark priest greeting his congregation. Did you think I would not discover your pathetic trap? His voice carried over the chaos with unnatural clarity. Did you think decades of planning could be undone by a mute prince and his Omega plaything? He gestured toward Lysandra, who had retreated behind a wall of her own guards. The Queen of Valdris was merely a tool, a convenient distraction while I positioned my true forces. She knows nothing of what I have built, nothing of what I have sacrificed. Sarah's mind raced. Their plan had been based on the assumption that Brennan would act through proxies, that he would maintain his cover until the last possible moment. But he had outmaneuvered them, anticipated their strategy, and prepared a counter. They were surrounded, outnumbered, trapped. And then Caspian did something no one expected. He laughed. The sound was silent, of course, but his shoulders shook, and his face split into a grin that held no fear, only fierce satisfaction. His hands moved in rapid signs that Sarah translated almost without thinking. "You are right, old man. We did set a trap, but not the one you discovered." Brennan's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "The war seal at my father's belt. Did you notice when Victor's guards replaced it with a decoy? Did you notice when the real seal was given to General Marcus, who has spent the last hour positioning our true forces around this hall?" As if summoned by his words, the doors at the far end of the chamber crashed open. Ravencrest warriors poured in, led by General Marcus himself, his sword already wet with the blood of enemies who had tried to stop his advance. At the same moment, the windows along the upper gallery shattered inward. More warriors rappelled down on ropes, dropping into the midst of Brennan's forces and engaging them with brutal efficiency. Victor appeared at Sarah's side, his sword drawn and his face grim. "Get to safety. We will handle this." "No!" Sarah shook her head, her grandmother's training surging through her veins. "I am done hiding. Show me where Brennan is." The battle raged around them as they pushed through the chaos. Sarah saw things she would never forget. Warriors locked in deadly combat, nobles cowering beneath overturned tables, blood spreading across the polished floor like dark wine spilled from a shattered goblet. And through it all, Caspian moved like a force of nature. The Silent Prince had trained for war his entire life, and now that training showed in every movement, every strike, every perfectly executed maneuver. He fought without sound, but with devastating effect, his sword cutting through enemy ranks while his free hand signed commands to the warriors around him. They could not hear his voice, but they could see his signs, and somehow, impossibly, they understood. "Left flank, hold the doors. Right flank, protect the civilians. Center, push forward to the throne." The commands flowed in a continuous stream, translated not by Sarah, but by the soldiers themselves. She realized with a shock of understanding that Caspian had been preparing for this moment for years. He had taught his most loyal warriors the silent language, building an army that could communicate without words, that could coordinate their attacks in perfect silence. An army that no enemy could anticipate. An army that could not be disrupted by the chaos of battle. An army commanded by a prince whose silence had become his greatest strength. Brennan saw it too, his face contorted with rage as he watched his forces being systematically destroyed. "Impossible," he snarled. "You are nothing, a broken prince, a defective heir. You cannot defeat me." He raised his hand, and Sarah saw a glint of silver, a blade, small but deadly, aimed directly at Caspian's unprotected back. She did not think, she simply moved. Her body slammed into Caspian, knocking him aside as the blade whistled through the space where he had been standing. She felt a line of fire across her arm as the weapon grazed her flesh, but she ignored the pain, spinning to face Brennan with her own small knife drawn and ready. The old man stared at her with something like wonder. "The last daughter of the crescent moon." His voice was almost reverent. "I should have killed you when I had the chance, just as I killed your grandmother, just as I killed everyone who carried that cursed bloodline." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You," her voice was barely a whisper, "you killed my grandmother. I killed all of them." Brennan's smile was terrible in its satisfaction. 50 years ago, when I was young and strong, I led the hunt that destroyed the Crescent Moon. I burned their villages. I slaughtered their healers. I erased their knowledge from the world. But why? Because they were abominations. Neither wolf nor human. Neither one thing nor another. They had no place in our society, and I cleansed the world of their impurity. Sarah felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. All her life, she had wondered about her grandmother's secrets, about the heritage that had been hidden from her. Now she knew the truth. Her people had not simply faded away. They had been murdered, systematically, deliberately, by the man standing before her. And there was more. There was always more with men like Brennan. You killed the queen. The realization came to her with terrible clarity. 5 years ago, you arranged the assassination. Brennan's smile widened. Evelyn Ravencrest was one of you, a crescent moon hiding in plain sight, polluting the royal bloodline with her tainted blood. I could not allow her to continue. I could not allow her son to inherit the throne. The scar on Caspian's throat, the wound that had stolen his voice. Sarah understood now why it had never fully healed, why even the best healers in the kingdom had been unable to restore what was lost. The blade had been poisoned, specifically designed to cause permanent damage to anyone with crescent moon blood. Caspian had survived because his mother's heritage had also given him resistance to the poison, but the damage had been done. His voice was gone, sacrificed in a futile attempt to save a woman who was already doomed. And Brennan had orchestrated all of it. You are a monster. I am a patriot. Brennan's voice rose with fanatical conviction. I am the guardian of our people's purity, and when I am finished here, the Ravencrest line will end, and a new dynasty will rise from its ashes, a pure dynasty, an uncorrupted dynasty. He raised his blade again, but this time Victor was faster. The captain of the guard appeared from the chaos of battle, his sword sweeping in a vicious arc that knocked the weapon from Brennan's hand. Before the old man could react, Victor had him pinned against a pillar, his blade pressed against the traitor's throat. For my father. Victor's voice was thick with emotion. For everyone you used and betrayed. For the prince whose mother you murdered. Justice comes at last. Brennan laughed, even with death at his throat. You think this is over? You think killing me will end what I have started? The forces I have set in motion cannot be stopped. The attack on your borders, the alliance with Valdris, the assassins waiting in the shadows. Even if I die today, Ravencrest will fall. Then it falls fighting. Caspian appeared at Sarah's side, his amber eyes blazing with cold fury. His hands signed words that she translated with fierce satisfaction. But you will not live to see it. Victor looked to his prince, waiting for the command. Take him alive. Caspian signed. He will stand trial for his crimes. The kingdom will know the truth about what he has done. Every betrayal, every murder, every innocent life he has destroyed. Brennan's face twisted with impotent rage as Victor's guards surrounded him, binding his hands and dragging him away from the battle. The old man screamed curses and threats, but no one was listening anymore. The tide had turned. Ravencrest's forces were winning. Brennan's mercenaries, without their leader to coordinate them, were falling into disarray. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered. Others tried to flee, only to be cut down by Victor's guards at the doors. And in the midst of the chaos, Queen Lysandra stood alone, her crimson gown stained with the blood of others, her face pale with the dawning realization that she had been used. General Marcus approached her with a squad of warriors at his back. Queen Lysandra of Valdris. His voice was formal, but hard. You are hereby detained pending investigation into your involvement in this conspiracy. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear. If you are guilty, you will face the same justice as Brennan. Lysandra's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time since her arrival, she seemed at a loss, her arrogance stripped away to reveal the uncertainty beneath. Dorian tried to slip away in the confusion, but Victor's guards were watching for exactly that. They seized him before he had taken 3 steps, adding him to the growing collection of prisoners being herded toward the dungeons. The battle was over. The enemy was defeated, but the cost had been high. Sarah surveyed the great hall, seeing the bodies of fallen warriors from both sides, nobles who had been caught in the crossfire, servants who had tried to protect their masters, good people who had died because one man's hatred had been allowed to fester for decades. She felt Caspian's hand find hers, his grip warm and steady despite everything that had happened. It is finished. His free hand signed the words. Brennan will face justice. The conspiracy is broken. Is it? Sarah looked at the destruction around them. How many more like him are out there? How many more who hate what I am, what we could become together? Caspian turned her to face him, his amber eyes soft with something that made her heart ache. There will always be those who fear what they do not understand, but there will also be those who see the truth, who recognize that strength comes in many forms, and that silence does not mean weakness. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. You saved my life today. You faced the man who murdered your grandmother, who destroyed your people, and you did not break. You stood and fought, not just for yourself, but for everyone in this hall." Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. I was terrified. "Courage is not the absence of fear." Caspian smiled, that rare expression that transformed his serious face into something beautiful. "Courage is being terrified and doing what must be done anyway. You have more courage than anyone I have ever known." Before she could respond, a commotion at the entrance to the hall drew their attention. King Aldrich was approaching, supported by General Marcus on one side and Victor on the other. The king had taken a wound during the battle, his left arm wrapped in bloody bandages, but he walked with his head high and his eyes clear. He stopped before his son, looking at Caspian with an expression that held decades of regret and a lifetime of unspoken words. "I was wrong." Aldrich's voice was rough with emotion. "I spent 5 years doubting you, distancing myself from you, allowing others to question your fitness to rule. I was a coward and a fool. Father, let me finish." The king raised his uninjured hand. "Tonight, I watched you lead our forces to victory against impossible odds. I watched you command an army without speaking a single word. I watched you face down the man who murdered your mother and bring him to justice." He reached to his belt and removed the war seal, the symbol of military command that he had carried for 40 years. "This belongs to you now. Not because I am giving it to you, but because you have earned it. You have proven yourself worthy of the Ravencrest throne, and I will not allow anyone to question that again." Caspian took the seal, his hands trembling slightly. "I do not want your throne." His signs were slow and careful, filled with emotion that his voice could never have conveyed. "I only want you to see me, to trust me, to believe that I can be the leader our people need." "I see you now." Aldrich's voice broke. "I see everything you have become, everything you have achieved in spite of my failures, and I am prouder than I have ever been of anything in my life." Father and son embraced, the king's arms wrapping around his heir with fierce intensity. The warriors around them cheered, their voices rising in a spontaneous celebration that echoed off the blood-stained walls. But Aldrich was not finished. When he stepped back from his son, there was a new resolve in his eyes. "I have been king of Ravencrest for 40 years. I have led our people through wars and famines, through triumph and tragedy, but my time is ending. I feel it in my bones, in the weariness that grows heavier with each passing day." "Father, you do not have to do this." "Yes, I do." Aldrich's voice was firm. "The attack tonight showed me what I should have seen long ago. Ravencrest needs a leader who can adapt to the challenges of a changing world. A leader who sees strength where others see weakness. A leader who can unite our people, not through the power of his voice, but through the force of his vision." He turned to face the assembled survivors of the battle, raising his voice so that all could hear. "Before these witnesses, I, Aldrich Ravencrest, do hereby abdicate my throne in favor of my son, Caspian Ravencrest. From this day forward he shall rule as king, with all the rights and responsibilities that title entails." The hall fell silent for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then the cheering began, starting as a murmur and building to a roar that shook the ancient stones. "Long live King Caspian! Long live the Silent King!" The coronation was held 1 week later. The great hall had been restored, the blood scrubbed from the floors and the damaged decorations replaced with new finery. Nobles from across the 5 kingdoms had gathered to witness the historic occasion, drawn by curiosity about the prince who had defeated a conspiracy that threatened to destroy them all. Brennan had confessed to everything under interrogation: the murders, the betrayals, the decades of manipulation that had warped the kingdom from within. His trial had been swift and his execution swifter, watched by crowds who had finally learned the truth about the monster in their midst. Lysandra had been cleared of direct involvement in the conspiracy, though her reputation had been severely damaged by her association with Brennan's plots. She had returned to Valdres in disgrace, her dreams of conquest shattered by the very ambition that had driven her. Dorian had not been so fortunate. Evidence had revealed him as Brennan's primary agent within the Valdres delegation, and he had been executed alongside his master. And now Caspian stood before the assembled multitudes, dressed in the ceremonial robes of kingship, ready to receive the crown that had been denied to him for so long. Sarah watched from her place at the side of the throne, her heart swelling with emotions she could not name. The past week had been a whirlwind of activity, filled with councils and conferences and endless discussions about the future of the kingdom. Through it all, Caspian had remained constant, steady, determined. He had stepped into his new role with a confidence that silenced even his harshest critics, proving through his actions what his voice could never have conveyed. Elder Thorn, the senior surviving member of the council, approached the new king with the crown in his hands. The ancient circlet gleamed in the candlelight, its gems catching and reflecting the glow like captured stars. "Caspian Ravencrest," Thorn's voice was solemn. "Do you swear to defend the kingdom of Ravencrest against all enemies, foreign and domestic? Do you swear to rule with wisdom and justice, placing the welfare of your people above your own desires?" Caspian's hands moved in response, and Sarah translated, her voice carrying across the silent hall. "I swear. Do you swear to honor the traditions of your ancestors while remaining open to the changes that the future may bring? Do you swear to be a beacon of strength and hope for all who call this kingdom home?" "I swear." Thorn placed the crown upon Caspian's head, and the hall erupted in cheers. "Long live King Caspian! Long live the Silent King! Long live Ravencrest!" The celebration continued long into the night, with feasting and dancing and joyous abandon. The shadow that had hung over the kingdom for so long had finally lifted, and the people reveled in their newfound freedom. But as the hours wore on and the festivities began to wind down, Caspian slipped away from the great hall. He found Sarah on the balcony where they had first begun to understand each other, standing beneath the stars and looking out at the snow-covered mountains. "You should be inside." Her signs were gentle, almost teasing. "The king cannot abandon his own celebration. The king needs a moment of quiet." Caspian moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. "And the king needs to speak with someone who sees him as more than a crown." Sarah turned to face him, her heart racing. "What do you see when you look at me?" She asked the question that had haunted her since the battle. "Do you see a healer? An interpreter? The last daughter of a murdered people?" Caspian studied her for a long moment, his amber eyes reflecting the starlight. "I see the woman who gave me back my voice. Not the voice I lost, but something better. Something that speaks in a language no one else can understand. A language that is ours alone." He reached into his coat and withdrew something that gleamed in the moonlight. A crown, smaller and more delicate than his own, fashioned of silver and sapphires arranged in a pattern that made Sarah's breath catch. A crescent moon embracing a star. "This belonged to my mother." His hands trembled slightly as he offered it to her. "She wore it on the day she married my father. She told me once that it was a symbol of her heritage, a reminder of who she truly was beneath the mask she was forced to wear." Sarah stared at the crown, unable to speak. "My mother was Crescent Moon, like you," Caspian continued. "She hid her true nature for years, afraid of what would happen if the truth was discovered. And in the end, her fear was justified. Brennan murdered her because of what she was." "And you want me to wear her crown?" Sarah finally found her voice. "You want me to proclaim to the world what I am? I want you to be proud of who you are." Caspian moved closer, his eyes burning with intensity. "I want you to stand beside me, not as an interpreter or an advisor, but as a queen. I want to show the world that the crescent moon is not something to be feared or destroyed, but something to be celebrated." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "The council will never accept it. The nobles will rebel. The other kingdoms will see it as weakness." "Let them!" Caspian's expression was fierce. "I am king now, and I will not allow fear to dictate who I love or who I choose to rule beside me." "You love me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, vulnerable and raw. Caspian smiled, that rare and precious expression that she had come to treasure above all others. "I have loved you since the moment you first spoke to me in the language of silence. I have loved you through every danger, every doubt, every moment of uncertainty. And I will love you until the day I die, regardless of what crown you wear or what name the world calls you." He held out the crown, a question and a promise wrapped in silver and sapphires. "Seraphina of the Crescent Moon, will you be my queen?" Sarah looked at the crown, then at the man who offered it. She thought of her grandmother, who had spent her life hiding and running and ultimately dying without ever being able to reveal her true self. She thought of her sister, waiting anxiously in the castle, hoping for news that her sacrifice had not been in vain. She thought of all the Crescent Moon who had been murdered by Brennan's hatred, their knowledge and their gifts erased from the world. And she thought of Caspian, the silent prince who had seen her when no one else could, who had given her a voice when she had resigned herself to silence. Yes. The word came out as barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of decisions. Yes, I will be your queen. Caspian placed the crown upon her head, his touch gentle as a prayer. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her beneath the stars, a silent declaration of love that needed no words to be understood. Below them, the kingdom of Ravencrest slept, unaware that its future had just been decided. In the great hall, the last of the revelers stumbled toward their beds. In the dungeons, the remnants of Brennan's conspiracy awaited their trials. And in the snow-covered mountains, the wind whispered secrets that only the old ones could understand. A new age was dawning. The ceremony that united them was held in the spring, when the snow had melted and the first flowers were beginning to bloom across the kingdom. Sarah wore a gown of silver and blue, with her mother's crown gleaming in her pale hair. She walked down the aisle of the great hall on the arm of General Marcus, who had offered to stand in place of the father she had never known. Caspian waited for her at the altar, resplendent in ceremonial robes that bore both the Ravencrest sigil and the crescent moon symbol. He had insisted on including both, a public declaration that the old divisions were over and a new era had begun. The ceremony was conducted in 2 languages. The priest spoke the traditional vows aloud, while Caspian and Sarah signed their responses in the silent tongue. It was unprecedented, unconventional, and absolutely perfect. When they were pronounced husband and wife, king and queen, the hall erupted in cheers that shook the rafters. Nobles who had once whispered about the Omega healer now bowed before her. Warriors who had doubted the silent prince now pledged their swords to his service. And Aldrich, the former king, watched from his place of honor with tears streaming down his weathered face. He had given his son a kingdom, but more importantly, he had finally given him the acceptance and love that he had withheld for too long. In the months that followed, Caspian and Sarah ruled together, their complementary strengths creating a partnership that transformed Ravencrest from within. The king's strategic brilliance combined with the queen's healing wisdom to create policies that benefited all their subjects, from the highest noble to the lowliest servant. The silent language spread throughout the kingdom, taught in schools and used in official proceedings alongside spoken words. What had once been viewed as a curiosity or a weakness became a source of pride, a unique tradition that set Ravencrest apart from its neighbors. And slowly, carefully, the legacy of the crescent moon began to emerge from the shadows. Sarah gathered every piece of knowledge she could find about her grandmother's people, preserving their healing techniques and their philosophical teachings for future generations. The genocide that Brennan had orchestrated could never be undone, but the culture he had tried to destroy could be rebuilt, one piece at a time. On the anniversary of their coronation, Sarah stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, looking out at the kingdom they had built together. Below her, the fortress of Ravencrest bustled with activity. Children played in the courtyards, merchants hawked their wares in the market square, warriors trained in the practice yards, their movements fluid and purposeful. And in the nursery behind her, a new life was beginning. Caspian appeared at her side, their infant daughter cradled carefully in his arms. The baby had her mother's silver hair and her father's amber eyes, a perfect blend of the bloodlines that had nearly been destroyed. "She is beautiful," Sarah signed, reaching out to stroke her daughter's cheek. "She is a miracle." Caspian's response was tender. A living proof that love can triumph over hatred, that the future can be different from the past. "What shall we name her?" Caspian smiled, his eyes bright with joy. "I was thinking we could call her Isolde, after your grandmother, to honor the woman who preserved the knowledge that made all of this possible." Sarah felt tears well in her eyes, happy tears, grateful tears. Isolde. She signed the name with reverence, the new beginning. They stood together on the balcony, the king and queen of Ravencrest, holding their daughter as the sun set over the mountains. The kingdom stretched before them, peaceful and prosperous, healed from the wounds of the past and ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. In the distance, a wolf howled, then another, and another. The voices of their people, rising in celebration of the life that had joined their pack. Sarah added her own voice to the chorus, a sound she had never made before, a howl of joy and triumph and belonging. Beside her, Caspian remained silent, but his arms tightened around their daughter, and his eyes met hers with a love that needed no words. In a world that had tried to destroy them both, they had found each other. In silence, they had discovered a language more powerful than speech, and in the darkness, they had kindled a light that would never be extinguished. The kingdom of silence had found its voice at last, and they lived, not happily ever after, but fully and truly, with all the challenges and joys that such a life entailed, together, always together, in silence and in love. The end.